There are moments in life that split time in two, before and after. For the farmers of Harlan County, Kentucky, the storm of October 1985 was exactly that kind of moment, not because of what it destroyed, but because of what it uncovered. This is that story. October 14th, 1985. 4:47 in the morning, Elmer Braxton, 61 years old, was already awake. He was always awake before sunrise. His father had taught him that. His grandfather had taught his father. It was the kind of thing that gets passed down without being said. You just do it, the way your blood does it for you. He was standing on the porch of a two-story farmhouse on Route 9, just outside Loyal, Kentucky, holding a tin mug of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. He hadn't noticed. He was watching the sky. The sky was wrong. He couldn't explain it the way a meteorologist would. He'd never been to college. He'd dropped out of Harlan County High in 1942 to help his father when the draft pulled 3 of their farmhands in the key same week. He knew the sky the way you know someone you've lived beside for 40 years, not perfectly, but deep. And that sky, that October morning, was moving the wrong way. The clouds weren't rolling in from the west like a normal storm. They were pulling up from the south, heavy and green-gray at the bottom, the kind of color that made old-timers in eastern Kentucky press their lips together and say nothing. Stay with me until the end. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Elmer set his cold coffee on the porch railing. He walked inside, went to the kitchen drawer where he kept his important papers, pulled out a single folded document, and put it in the inside pocket of his canvas work jacket. That document would matter later, more than he could possibly know. Let me tell you about Elmer Braxton before the storm, because you need to understand who this man was to understand what happened next. Elmer had farmed the same 280 acres his entire life. His grandfather, Clem Braxton, had bought the land in 1901 for $420, saved over 11 years of railroad work. The deed was handwritten. Clem had framed it and hung it in the kitchen, where every Braxton since had eaten breakfast beneath it. By 1985, that land was worth somewhere between $180,000 and $220,000, depending on who you asked. But Elmer had a problem that had nothing to do with the land's value. He had debt, not because he was reckless, not because he was foolish, because 1980 happened, because 1981 happened. Because the farm crisis that had been building across Appalachia, like a slow flood, finally reached Harlan County, and when it came for everyone. In 1979, Elmer had taken out a $47,000 operating loan from First Federal Savings of Harlan to expand his cattle operation. His neighbor Roy Cashin had done the same thing. So had the Tillman brothers over on Puckett's Creek Road. The loan officer at the time, a smooth-talking 34-year-old named Gerald Pitts, had practically begged them to borrow interest. Rates were high, Pitts had said, but land values were rising, always rising. You borrow now, you expand now, and in 5 years you pay it back easy. Gerald Pitts drove a 1978 Buick Riviera and wore a tie clip that caught the light when he talked. And he talked a lot. By 1982, the interest rate on Elmer's loan had climbed to over 17%. The beef market had collapsed. His cattle were worth 40 cents on the dollar from what he'd expected when he bought them. He was making payments, but barely, scraping together what he could from a small tobacco allotment, from selling timber off the back 40, from his wife Ruth's work at the diner in Cumberland 3 days a week. Ruth. Let me tell you about Ruth. Ruth Braxton, née Combs, was 58 years old in 1985. She'd been married to Elmer for 36 years. She had the kind of quiet strength that doesn't announce itself. She didn't make speeches, didn't cry in front of people, didn't complain. But if you watched her hands while she worked, they never stopped moving. Even sitting still, her fingers would be folding something, smoothing something, turning something over. Like her body didn't know how to stop solving problems. She had lost a son in 1971. Bobby Braxton, 19 years old, killed in a truck accident on Route 119 during a November ice storm. He was on his way back from Middlesbrough. He never made it. After Bobby, Ruth kept two things close: her faith and her silence about certain kinds of pain. She and Elmer had two other children, a daughter, Linda, who lived in Lexington, and a son, Dale, who worked the farm beside his father every day. Dale was 32 in 1985. Built like Elmer had been built 30 years earlier. Wide shoulders, big hands, slow to speak. He had his mother's patience and his father's stubbornness. He hadn't married yet. He'd come close once, a woman named Sheila from over in Bell County, but it hadn't worked out, and Dale had put that chapter away somewhere he didn't open anymore. The debt was eating at Dale more than he let on. He had started studying the loan, papers at night after his father went to bed, not because Elmer asked him to. Because Dale had begun to feel something that he couldn't name yet, a suspicion, small and stubborn, that something in those numbers wasn't right. Now let me explain why that suspicion mattered more than anyone in Harlan County could have guessed. By the fall of 1985, Elmer was 4 months behind on his loan payments. He owed First Federal approximately $6,200 in arrears. Gerald Pitts, still at the bank, still wearing that tie clip, had sent 2 letters. Elmer had read them both and put them in the kitchen drawer beneath the deed. The neighbors weren't doing better. Roy Cashin had already sold off his back pasture, 60 acres that his family had owned since 1923, just to stay current on his note. The Tillman brothers had split up their operation. The older one, Harold, had taken a job at the coal preparation plant in Evarts just to keep the lights on. There was a meeting at the Loyal Baptist Church in September of that year. About 40 farmers came. Gerald Pitts was not invited, but word got back to him. The mood in that church was somewhere between grief and fury, the quiet kind that Eastern Kentucky men carry without showing. One man stood up near the back. His name was Curtis Vance, and he farmed about 190 acres over toward Path Fork. Curtis was the kind of man who believed that if you worked hard enough, no problem could stay. He had said that exact thing at 3 previous meetings. He said it. Again that night, Elmer listened. He didn't say anything. But Dale watched his father's face, and what he saw there was not agreement. After the meeting, walking to the truck in the dark, Dale said, "Dad, those loan papers, the ones from '79, can I look at them again?" Elmer said, "They're in the drawer." That was all he said. That was enough. What Dale found over the next 2 weeks of night reading, under a single lamp at the kitchen table while his father slept and his mother moved quietly around the house, was not simple. It wasn't the kind of thing you could explain in a sentence. But at its heart, it came down to this. The variable interest rate on Elmer's 1979 loan had been applied in a way that did not match the terms as written in the original agreement. Not dramatically. Not obviously, just slightly. In a way that, compounded monthly over 6 years, had added thousands of dollars to a balance that should have been lower. Possibly much lower. Dale wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't an accountant. He was a farmer who had barely gotten through high school algebra. But he could read a number, and he could see when a number was growing faster than it should. He wrote everything down in a spiral notebook. He checked it twice. Then he drove 40 minutes to Harlan and asked a retired schoolteacher named Marvin Fugate, who did taxes for half the county out of his living room, to look at what he'd found. Marvin Fugate looked at Dale's notebook for a long time. Then he looked up and said, "Boy, you need a real lawyer." That was September 20th, 1985. The storm came 3 weeks later, and on the morning of October 14th, when Elmer Braxton stood on his porch and watched the sky move wrong, he had the loan document in his inside pocket because Dale had asked him to keep it close, just in case. What neither of them understood yet was that the storm wasn't going to take anything from them. It was going to give them something back. The storm hit Harlan County at 6:23 in the morning. It wasn't a tornado. It was something harder. To name, a derecho, the meteorologists would call it later, a fast-moving line of severe thunderstorms that pushed a wall of straight-line wind at nearly 80 miles per hour across the ridges and hollows of southeastern Kentucky. Trees that had stood for 100 years came down in minutes. Power lines crossed roads. 3 barns in the county collapsed before breakfast. Elmer's farm took the hit hard. The north fence line went down for nearly 300 yards. The old tobacco barn, built in 1934 by Clem Braxton with hand-cut timber, lost its roof entirely, the tin sheeting peeling back like the lid of a sardine can. 8 cattle got out through the broken fence and were found an hour later standing in a confused cluster on Route 9 blocking both lanes. Dale and Elmer worked through the morning in the rain. Ruth brought food out to the porch at noon, but neither of them came in to eat it. There was too much to look at, too much to count. It was around 2 in the afternoon, when the rain had softened to a grey drizzle, that Dale was walking the north fence line to see what posts could be saved and which needed to be pulled, and he stopped. There was something in the ground. The wind and water had cut a deep erosion channel along the fence line. 3-4 inches of topsoil gone in some places, the red clay beneath exposed and wet and raw. And in one section, where an old corner post had stood since before either of them could remember, the erosion had pulled back the earth to reveal something underneath. Stone, but not natural stone. Cut stone, flat on top, laid in a deliberate pattern. Dale stood there in the drizzle and stared at it. He walked back to the barn and got a flat spade and came back and started carefully moving the loose, wet soil away from the edges. What he found, over the next 40 minutes, was a stone-lined cistern, dry, hand-built, maybe 6 feet deep, that no one in the Braxton family had known was there, or maybe someone had. Maybe they'd just never said. At the bottom of the cistern, sitting, on a flat stone shelf as if placed there carefully and deliberately, was a steel box, military surplus by the look of it, painted olive green, hinged with a padlock that had rusted shut decades ago. Dale didn't open it there. He carried it back to the house, set it on the kitchen table, and called for his father. Elmer came in, from the back field. He was soaked to the knees and smelled like wet hay. He looked at the box on his kitchen table, and something moved across his face that Dale had never seen before. Not recognition exactly, more like the edge of a memory he'd been told about but never owned. Ruth came in from the other room. She looked at the box. She looked at Elmer. She said, "Is that what I think it is?" Elmer said, "I don't know what you think it is." But his voice was different when he said it. They broke the padlock with a cold chisel and a hammer. It took 4 hits. Inside, sealed against the damp in oilcloth wrapped twice around, they found 3 things. A letter. Dated June 4th, 1931, a bundle of documents tied with a piece of cord that had gone black with age, and cash. Old bills, Depression-era bills. Dry because the oilcloth had held. They didn't count the money that night. They read the letter first. It was from Clem Braxton, Elmer's grandfather. Written in pencil in the slanted, deliberate hand of a man who had learned to write late in life and took it seriously. The letter said this: "If you are reading this, things have gotten hard enough that you needed to look. I buried this in 1931, when the banks were taking everything from everybody and I did not trust any of them with what I'd saved. There is money here, not a fortune, but enough to hold on. The land is worth more than any bank will ever tell you. Do not let them have it." The documents beneath this letter are the original property survey from 1901 and a second deed I had drawn up privately, that some county men tried to make disappear in 1922. I kept them. They prove the back 40 is ours, clear and uncontested. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Hold on, Elmer. Hold on. The letter was addressed to Elmer by name. Clem Braxton had buried it sometime in 1931, and somehow he had known, or hoped, or prayed, that if the land ever came under threat again, it would be his grandson who found it. Ruth Braxton sat down in a kitchen chair and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed very carefully for a long time. Dale looked at his father. Elmer was still holding the letter. He read it again, silently. Then he folded it exactly along the original crease lines and set it down gently. He said, "Go get that lawyer's number from the drawer. Let me tell you about what happened next, because this is where the story stops being just about one family and starts being about all of them. Dale called the lawyer, a man named Stephen Reese out of Harlan, who had done some agricultural, legal work and had been recommended by Marvin Fugate. Reese came out to the farm 2 days after the storm. He sat at the same kitchen table and looked at everything Dale had found in the loan papers, and then he looked at the documents from the steel box, and then he sat quietly for a while. Then he said, "I need to make some calls." What Reese had found, piecing together Dale's arithmetic with the original 1979 loan agreement, was a pattern, not just in the Braxton loan. He'd heard similar complaints from other farmers and had always assumed they couldn't prove it. But Dale's notebook, methodical and specific, was different from a complaint. It was a record. Reese reached out to a colleague in Lexington who had been working on farm loan disputes across the state. That colleague knew another attorney in Louisville who had filed a formal complaint with the Kentucky Department of Financial Institutions 6 months earlier regarding variable rate calculation practices at 3 rural lending institutions. First, Federal Savings of Harlan was one of the 3. The complaint had stalled. It needed documentation. It needed specific numbers from specific loans, not just general allegations. What Dale Braxton had put together in that spiral notebook was exactly what was needed to move it forward. By the first week of November 1985, Stephen Reese had contacted attorneys representing 11 other farm families in Harlan County alone, families who had noticed similar discrepancies but had no way to prove what they felt was wrong. With Dale's notebook as a template, they began going back through their own loan documents and finding the same patterns. Gerald Pitts, who was by now the Assistant Vice President of First Federal, was informed by his own bank's legal department in mid-November that a multi-party complaint had been filed with state regulators. He stopped wearing the tie clip after that. The bank sent a letter to the Braxton farm on November 19th. It was not a collection notice. It was a request to meet. Elmer read the letter at the kitchen table. He handed it to Dale. Dale handed it to Ruth. Ruth set it face down on the table and went back to what she was doing. The meeting happened on December 3rd, 1985, at the offices of First Federal Savings in Harlan. Elmer and Dale came with Stephen Reese. Gerald Pitts was in the room with 2 other bank representatives and the bank's own attorney, a man from Lexington who had driven down that morning and looked uncomfortable. The entire time. The meeting lasted 3 hours. The outcome was not immediate. These things never are. But what Reese walked out of that building with was a signed agreement to review the interest calculation methodology on 12 farm loans in Harlan County, effective immediately, with the possibility of retroactive adjustment. Pending regulatory guidance. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was the door opening. What Elmer had put in his inside pocket on the morning of the storm, the original 1979 loan document, turned out to be a version he had signed that differed in one clause from the version in the bank's own files. A clause about the ceiling on variable rate adjustments. One version had a ceiling, the other didn't. The bank's version didn't. Nobody could say with certainty at that point whether it was error or intention. Reese said privately to Dale that he didn't think it mattered much which one it was, legally speaking. What mattered was that the document Elmer had kept, the one he'd folded into his jacket pocket that October morning because his son had asked him to keep it safe, was different from the bank's record, and Elmer's version was the one he'd actually signed. Curtis Vance, the man from Path Fork, who believed hard work cured everything, called Elmer in December. He'd been included in the group of 11 families. He was quiet on the phone for longer than was normal for him. Then he said, "Elmer, I owe you something." Elmer said, "You don't owe me anything." Curtis said, "I sat in that church in September and told everybody it would be fine if they just worked harder. I said it in front of you." Elmer said, "You believed it." Curtis said, "I was wrong." Elmer said, "Well, now we both know." That was all. It was enough. By the spring of 1986, 4 of the 12 families had received formal written notifications of loan recalculation with adjustments that reduced their outstanding balances. The Braxton adjustment was $8,400. more than eliminating. The arrears, and putting Elmer slightly ahead on his note for the first time in 4 years, Roy Cashin's adjustment was $11,200. He wept when Reese told him. He was not a man who wept easily. He was 63 years old and had not cried since his wife's funeral in 1978. He cried in Stephen Reese's office in Harlan, and Reese, who had seen a great deal of difficult things in his career, had to look out the window for a while. The 60 acres Roy had sold off, the land his family had owned since 1923, did not come back. That loss was real, and it stayed real. Some things a storm can't fix. But Roy kept the rest. He kept the house. He kept the fields his father had broken with a mule. That was not nothing. The cash from the steel box, once they counted it, slowly at the kitchen table, with the deed from 1901 and the letter from 1931 laid beside it, was $480 in Depression-era bills. Some of it was no longer legal tender. What was still usable, Ruth converted at a bank in Middlesbrough. They kept the bills that weren't usable. Ruth put them in an envelope with Clem's letter and placed them in the same kitchen drawer where Elmer had always kept his important papers, beneath the deed, beneath the loan documents, right where they belonged. In the spring of 1986, Elmer walked his back 40 for the first time since the storm. The ground was soft with snowmelt, and the redbuds were coming out along the ridgeline the way they always did, reckless and early, not waiting for the frost to finish. He walked slowly, the way he always walked, not because he was old, though he was getting there, but because he'd learned a long time ago that land rewards the people who move through it carefully. He stopped, at the corner where the old cistern had been. Dale had filled it in and reset the fence post. The ground there looked like any other piece of ground now. You wouldn't know anything had ever been buried there, but Elmer knew. He stood there for a while and thought about Clem, a man he'd known only as a very old man, a man who had lived through things that Elmer's generation had only been told about. A man who had buried his savings in the ground because he didn't trust the institutions of his time to protect what he'd built. He thought about Dale sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp and a spiral notebook, doing arithmetic in the middle of the night, because something felt wrong, and he couldn't let it go. He thought about Ruth, who had kept moving her hands, kept working, kept the diner shifts and the cooking and the quiet steadiness that had held the whole structure up when the debt threatened to pull it down. He thought about October 14th, the wrong sky, the cold coffee, the document in his inside pocket. There is a thing that farmers know that most people spend their whole lives trying to learn. You cannot control the storm. You cannot bargain with it or schedule it or convince it to wait. What you can control is what you've built before it arrives, what you've kept, what you've written down, what you've buried in the ground against. The day when everything gets stripped away and what's left has to be enough. Clem Braxton had known that in 1931. He had buried what mattered and written a letter to a grandson he couldn't have been certain would ever find it. He had trusted the land to keep his secret until the land decided the time was right. The storm of October 1985 was the land deciding. Elmer pulled his jacket collar up against the morning chill and walked back toward the house, where the light in the kitchen window meant Ruth had coffee on, and Dale would be in shortly from the milking, and the day was, as days on a farm always are, already asking something of him. He was not a man who believed in luck. He believed in preparation. He believed in keeping your documents. He believed in sons who stayed up late and asked the right questions. He believed in the particular kind of love that looks like stubbornness, the refusal to let go of something. Just because someone in a good suit tells you it's time. The redbud trees were blooming against the ridge. The cattle were moving in the lower field. Somewhere on Route 9, a truck was pulling away from somebody's driveway, starting the long process of the day. Elmer Braxton went inside. He hung his jacket on the same hook his father had used. He sat in the same chair at the same table where Clem's deed still hung on the wall above the window, handwritten in 1901, framed in wood that had darkened to the color of good earth. He picked up his coffee. This time, he drank it while it was still warm.